Hi everybody, welcome to Humanities 202, the summer version. I'm Dr. Bluen. This is our effort to condense 15 weeks of material into 8 weeks. So what you can imagine is going to be a very packed summer session, but I hope it won't be a terribly painful way to spend your summer. To begin, today we're going to be talking about, in this first lecture, the Irish Renaissance. And this is meant to be an addendum to or a continuation of the Dr. Hoover lecture that you've seen that's over in Angel. If you have any issues getting a hold of that, please do let me know. But this is just going to be a kind of detailed look at some of the poems that you've read for today from William Butler Yeats. Now, to begin, we're discussing mostly the 20th century in this particular course. To understand the 20th century requires a kind of Janus-faced approach. That is to say, it is the best of times, it is the worst of times. There are technological advances that would not have seemed possible to people living in the 19th century. Incredible advances in technology and medicine and other areas. On the other hand, there are still, and it is probably our bloodiest century on record, there are world wars, colonization, slavery, human rights abuses. These things reach their kind of highest watermark during the course of the 20th century. So it's a mixed bag, to say the least. So it's only appropriate that we begin those conversations with two of those very ambivalent texts. We're going to be talking about Things Fall Apart, the Achebe novel, in the next lecture, which you should currently be reading. But it's also appropriate to begin here, to begin in Ireland, because the Irish Renaissance is, if nothing else, a direct response to two of the major ideas that we're going to see as a thread throughout. Of course, it's always dangerous to say you're going to have a thread throughout such a long period of time and over such a broad swath of countries and peoples. But nevertheless, we are going to do our best to create that narrative. And the narrative begins here, I think. It begins with modernization and its response. Now, not everybody was on board the progress train, so to speak. Some of them wanted to jump ship and idealized or dreamed of a world prior to modernization or post-modernization. Anything that was not a part of the kind of run-of-the-mill, factory-like existence that was beginning to take shape in the early 20th century. Not to mix metaphors with the trains, the planes, and the automobiles there with the jumping on board. But nevertheless, here we're talking about a response to modernization, resistance to modernization. And William Butler Yeats is going to exemplify that for us in a number of ways. The second thing that we want to pay attention to in particular is colonization. Ebbs and flows of colonization. There are these blocks or single powerful nations that have spheres of influence or like to control, dictate terms to colonial orbiting entities or communities. This process of colonization in the 20th century both grows stronger than it had ever been, and then kind of retracts itself or contracts with these decolonization movements, colonized people seeking autonomy or freedom for themselves. And this wrestling match back and forth, modernization and its alternatives, colonization and its alternatives, this is an ideal place to start at the tension between these two forces. We'll be coming back to these time and time again over the course of our discussion of the 20th century. I also want to remind us a little bit to go back to Dr. Hoover's lecture and highlight some of the main points that she raised. One point, Irish nationalism. William Butler Yeats is very interested in creating or constructing a national identity for the Irish, because Irish identity at this point, up until this time, is largely subsumed under the British colonizing identity. So in order to fight for their liberty, to fight for an actual sovereign nation, that requires, on the literary or cultural side, an ability to articulate exactly what Irish culture means. What does it mean to be Irish? And this is something that William Butler Yeats is going to concern himself with greatly. One thing that he tries to do is harken back to the Druids, or this kind of mystical ideal that was a part of early Irish history, though it was never made into a cohesive national form prior to this point. Yeats is going to call upon the Druids and their ideas in order to better cement his own sense of what being Irish means. Now, all of this is actually useful and productive in terms of creating an alternative to the colonial way of life and to the modern way of life. One thing that is always the case for things like this, where countries or peoples try to harken back to romantic, old, the way things used to be. Back when I was a young child, I used to walk in 10 feet of snow, and I never complained about it. Those kind of looking way back or projecting back into the past almost always create an idea or create an illusion that isn't entirely based on fact. And so, as Dr. Hoover points out, Yeats sometimes stretched the truth, borrowed a little bit loosely from other traditions, or in some cases just flat out invented traditions in order to create a romanticized old Ireland. And this happened, Ireland is certainly not the only case in which this happened, but whenever you try to create this imaginary time long ago, you are also going to risk losing hold over the truth, the way things actually were in those time periods and with those people. So, with those points being made, I would like to turn our attention to the poems themselves. Here's how this is going to work. I am going to read the poem. Hopefully you have the poems in front of you. If you don't have them in front of you right now, you should probably pause the computer, go get some popcorn, watch an episode of Duck Dynasty or something, and then come back with the poems in front of you. I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to make a couple of points, and hopefully you'll jot down some notes and be able to use this in your paper when it's time to write the response. So, we begin with Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Theme number 1 that we will see resonate through the remainder of the poems as well. This kind of juxtaposition that takes place in the final 2 lines of the poem. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. The entire poem sets up a juxtaposition between the modern realm, the realm that is loud, the realm that is not part of nature, where there are bees and trees and honey, the sweet paradise of a world removed from the city. when he's standing on the roadway or on the gray pavement, he's dreaming of what is missing, what is absent, what is pre-modern or anti-modern, or before, when Irish identity was something mystical and different than what it has become under the routine glare of the colonial forces. So, Irish modernists generally, and Yeats is one of the forerunners here, imagines what is absent. That is, Irish identity is no longer there. It's something missing. It's a dream. It's a figment of the imagination. A powerful one, maybe even a true one, but it is not present. He must be standing on the roadway, the pavement gray. He must be in the modern in order to understand what the modern is not. When he talks about the deep heart's core, he's constructing this mystical essence, this thing that all Irish people presumably can tap into. It exists deep within them. So he's constructing this idea that there's some kind of force or supernatural thread that links all Irish people to their ancestry and to their homeland. This construct of a mystical connection is crucial to building Irish nationalism, but again, it is highly romanticized and based on very intangible kinds of things rather than things in the material world. Okay, next, I would like to turn to Easter 1916, one of his most famous poems. As you may or may not know, in 1916 there is a big rebellion by Irish individuals against the colonial powers. As a response to this, many Irish are brutally slaughtered in what is known now as Easter 1916. There's a U2 song about it if you want a pop culture reference to it, or you could read something actually about the event, but either way you're going to learn a little bit about it if you look it up. So here we go, Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful, she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter, seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it, where long-legged moor's hens dive and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. O when may it suffice? That is heaven's part, our part to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death, after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed, and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, Macdonough and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, whenever green is worn, are changed utterly. a terrible beauty is born. Now, a couple of things I want to point out about this poem. Obviously, it's a kind of eulogy for the fallen Irish who are left behind. They too have become an absence, something that is idealized and romanticized as existing outside of the modern or the colonial. They're like ghosts, they're held apart or separate. In the third stanza, he mentions enchanted to a stone. Hearts with one purpose seem enchanted to a stone. This stone, which exists in the middle of a troubled, living stream, is again an important juxtaposition. The stone is actually what the term Ireland means. I mean, this is a symbol for the nation is this particular stone. And the stone, which is Ireland, which is the loyal heart, the heart that is the deep essence heart, is something that is fixed. It's permanent. It sits in the middle of all this tumult, all this killing, all this death, all of this life and hatred and love and all these tumultuous things. In the middle of it is this permanent stone. So even though we change, the world changes, minute by minute change, even when the limbs run wild and the horse is splashing and life, which is dizzying and unceasing, in the middle of this is some kind of permanent essence, a stone. And even though we see this tumult and chaos of the Irish as they're being slaughtered, and that has its own source of lamentation, on the other side, once they are dead, a terrible beauty is born. Amidst all of this change, there is something that is permanent, that is real, that is fixed. And again, that something is presumably, perhaps, Irish nationalism. All right, so we're going to move on to the third poem here that I want to talk about. An Irishman foresees his death. Pay attention while I'm reading this. Look for signs of mysticism or some kind of supernatural or otherworldly idea. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan cross, my countrymen Kiltartans poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public man nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. A key idea here, I think, is this idea of balance. Of course, the term balance is mentioned a number of times towards the end of the poem. But here, an Irishman is caught in the middle of thinking about what has been, what was, essentially caught in the train of progress. He's caught in the logic of progress. And against all of that, this particular Irishman seems to strike a balance, and it's that mystical sense, that sense of symmetry in which life and death are held in balance with one another, rather than focusing on the impermanence, on the limbs that run wild, on the crazy stream, on the death, on the gray pavement. Rather than focus on these things, Yeats encourages the reader through his poetic ideals to attain a sense of balance and harmony. And this is supposedly going to be the heart of the mystical Irish essence. This is going to be at the very center of what it means to be Irish, is to be able to hold forever in balance that which is gone and missing but permanent and fixed, and the impermanence and fickleness of the world that we live in, the chaos of the world that we live in, especially in the early 20th century Ireland, and must endure every day. If you can hold those things somehow together in balance, you will find peace and tranquility, and that is something connected to Irishness as well. All right. The last poem I want to talk about today before we conclude our discussion of the poems, The Second Coming, probably his most famous or oft-cited work. See if you notice something that sounds familiar or should sound familiar to you in the first verse. All right. The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. A waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? This imagery of the Sphinx, desert birds, all of these things, a number of academics have looked at what these things are referencing, and all of it again is tied back, as Dr. Hoover mentioned, to these myth cycles, these myths not only of Ireland but other ancient myths as well. So Yeats is tapping into that mythology. We also see again this sense of juxtaposition as a way of perhaps getting us to begin thinking about harmony. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So the best people in the early 20th century completely forfeit their convictions. The worst are far too passionate and intense and fixed in their ideas. And so these juxtaposition of zealots and nihilists are held greatly apart from one another, and there becomes an increased lack of harmony between the two forces. You cannot find a harmony between what is fixed and what is impermanent, what is death and what is the chaos of life. If you don't hold those things in balance, according to Yeats, gradually, as the title of Achebe's novel borrows from, things fall apart. In the modern world appears to us here as a desert, a wasteland, sterile. This is an image used by T.S. Eliot and other modernists as well, that the modern world is devoid of meaning or substance. It's dry and barren. And this seems extraordinarily grim, but in some ways this idea of a second coming might bring at least a degree of optimism, because it means that change is continuing, change is happening, and the center perhaps, if we look at it from a particular light, is not such a positive thing anyway, because the center here, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. If you think about that in colonial terms, you have the colonizer and the colonized, and the colonizer is the falconer, the colonized here is the falcon, and up until this time of fighting back, for Ireland just simply obeyed the falconer, returned, would fly, would return, obey what it is asked to do. But this artificial center cannot hold. The center cannot hold, and as a result, things will fall apart. But things falling apart, especially in Achebe's novel, but I think also for Yeats, things falling apart gives us an opportunity to put them back together, to rekindle a kind of however mystical, however romanticized sense of harmony and balance between the forces of the world, the forces that give us a sense of being rooted or anchored, and the sense that the world is fleeting and of the moment. So, in sum here, when we talk about the Irish Renaissance, we are really establishing some of the most important themes that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the summer. I hope you can take away from this some things as you're reading Things Fall Apart. Think about some of those tensions, some of those juxtapositions, some of those mystical ideals juxtaposed with certain Western ideas that we will be turning to, and I think you'll be able to draw some interesting connections. All right, I will see you in Lecture 2 of the week, whenever you so choose to watch it. All right, bye.